Here in Chapter 1 of Critical Thinking in Psychology and Everyday Life, we are taking a look at some of the foundational issues that go into critical thinking that will span different disciplines, but we're obviously going to be focusing on psychology. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at a few things. First, we're going to be looking at how to explain what critical thinking is and why it's important. We'll be talking about displaying working knowledge of important terms such as claim, evidence, argument, counterargument, and conclusion. We'll be distinguishing arguments from non-arguments and facts from opinions and inferences, which is always a big task. We'll recognize some common thinking errors and psychological misconceptions about critical thinking and the ways that sometimes we develop a sense of what we know based on irrelevant or unreasonable ways of knowing. So we'll start out with what do you think prompt, and this will get you thinking about a particular scenario. So let's take a look at it. So who believes that the moon affects behavior? There's a lot of thought out there that people who act out usually do so during a full moon, or that more babies are born during a full moon, etc., etc. There's a lot of thought out there. There's even a term called lunatics. Luna is the name of the moon, Luna, and it's something that was thought to have mystical value, but we now kind of know that it really doesn't. So even though we know that, nearly 81% of mental health professionals believe that the moon affects behavior. I'm a mental health professional, and I used to believe that to some degree, that boy, people just seem to act out more or have psychotic symptoms or whatever it is more during a full moon, but that's actually not true, as we'll learn. And nearly half of people in college believe that the moon or a full moon affects behavior. This image demonstrates through classical art that people had some kind of influence by the moon, and that people would behave oddly. And what's interesting about this is that the only people in this picture that appear to be influenced by the moon are women. Well, we know that that's not true, but we also know from in classical art that unfortunately women were depicted in certain ways, usually as deficient, etc., etc. That's not the class for this, but it does happen. The men seem to be afraid of the dancing women. How dare they? So, do you think that people behave abnormally during a full moon? So if you think this, then you might be falling prey to a certain type of thinking error. We'll get to that a little bit later. And the way that you think about this might be just a theory. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is theory. And is one theory just as good as another? Because they're all just theories. So what's it matter, right? Can astrologers predict the future? So astrology, this parapsychological phenomenon, right? Can they predict the future? Is there a way for them to know what's going to happen before it happens based on astrological alignment, the stars and moon and things like that? So another thing to think about: do opposites attract in romantic relationships? Is it important to find someone who's the opposite of you? Because after all, opposites attract. And another thing to consider is, should I stick with my first answer on a test, or should I switch to a different answer? So do you go with your gut, or do you stick with the answer that you thought through more critically? So these are some things to ponder, some things that you might think of yourself on a day-to-day basis, but we're going to take a look at how we can critically think about these issues using arguments and such. So the truth about the moon does not cause people to behave abnormally. Psychiatric admissions do not increase during a full moon. A full moon does not lead to more suicides. And really, there's no evidence that suggests that there is a difference in abnormal behavior during a full moon. As a matter of fact, what we find is that hospital admissions, for example, tend to go up on Mondays because people don't get admitted to the hospital over the weekends as often. Doctors will put off hospital admissions as much as they can so that they're not happening over the weekend. So we find that Monday and Tuesday you're more likely to have hospital admissions, even psychiatric hospital admissions. And it's really not based on the moon; it's just based on work schedules. Okay, so where do your opinions come from? There's lots of ways of knowing something. And knowing is kind of in quotes because we don't know the truth of something all the time. But what we do know is based on our perception of what reality is, based on the evidence that we have for our ideas. So sometimes we go with our gut. So that's intuition. And in some cases, it's a good idea to go with your gut. You know, you're in a sketchy neighborhood and things don't feel right. You know, you don't want to ask around and say, hey, is everything safe out here? You're going to probably go with your gut and do something. Do people get opinions or do they learn something from the media that becomes part of what they know? That probably happens far too often. What about faith and authority? There are people out there that have authority in a particular topic. So because they have this kind of authority, do we put faith in them? Do we put our understanding of something, or do we base that on what somebody is telling us who appears to know something? Okay. And then what about quote research unquote? Right, which is different than a regular research word. You've probably seen on Facebook or Instagram that people do their research and they learn about a topic. And when somebody doesn't know something, invariably somebody on Facebook is going to say, you should do your own research. Okay. What they probably mean to say is you should go Google something or find information that supports your way of thinking. Or maybe you should go out and find information that supports the way that I think. That way you'll believe what I think. And that is what they really mean by research. Research is different when you put it in quotes compared to doing actual research where you're talking about it, going through the literature that's out there, the valuable, reasonable literature, the gold standard literature, and trying to parse through that, as opposed to the research that's based on finding evidence that supports the way you already think through the confirmation bias. So the last one then is that research, the unquoted research, where we'll try to find evidence that looks critically at an idea, or we might find evidence on both sides of an idea and weigh it ourselves and decide if the evidence supports a reasonable way of thinking. That's what we really mean by research. So we have these kind of 5 basic ways that we can form an opinion, and there are probably some other ones, like maybe experience is another one, or maybe something that's based on cultural norms. That's another way of forming opinions. But these are 5 basic ways that we can form opinions. So when we think about opinions, we're talking about learning how to think about something, not what to think. Learning what to think is based on your formulation of an opinion, based on all the evidence that supports supports each side, and then coming to a conclusion about what side you're going to be on. And the process of how to think is what we call critical thinking. We want you to look critically at a topic, not just believe the first thing you see or believe it because somebody important said it, but to weigh out the evidence and the arguments that are being provided to you and making a decision that's clear, that's based on the evidence and not just based on opinion or other ways of knowing something. So critical thinking is that method, and it uses reflective thinking, right? So thinking about your own thinking, so this kind of metacognition or this meta thought process that looks at evaluating the evidence relevant to what somebody is saying. So if somebody makes a claim, they need to support that with evidence. Most of the time they don't. As we go through this course, we're going to look at ways that people will support their claims, but they won't be based on critical thinking. Okay. And then after you've done some evaluating of the evidence, you come to a well-reasoned conclusion that's based on the evidence. And in some cases, it will change your original opinion. One of the big problems that people have is that they will go along with the same line of thinking regardless of what evidence is being provided. And that is definitely not critical thinking. All right, so what then exactly is critical thinking? So critical thinking is reflective. So like I mentioned before, it's this metacognitive process. It's thinking about thinking. So when we think about thinking, what we're doing is we're challenging ourselves to walk through a process that really evaluates the way that we interpret and take in information. Not just to take it in and kind of think about it, but to think about the way we think about it. Again, it's kind of meta. So what we want to do is evaluate the evidence that's relevant. okay, that's relevant to a claim, and we need to look at reasoning that supports and does not support a claim. And we need to be able to evaluate those things. Most people just look at whatever evidence supports the way that they already think, not critical thinking. So we want to find those claims, find the evidence that's relevant to the claim. That way we can decide whether to support it or not. So that's what defines reason. Reason is when we come to some kind of truth about a claim, about a statement. And we use reason in a way to support the evidence, or excuse me, not to support the evidence, but to use the evidence to support the way that we think. So reasoning through something, again, isn't just looking for the information that supports how I already think, but looking at all the information that's relevant to the topic and then making a decision on that topic or on that question or claim, whatever it is, that's based on critical approaches. When we think of the word critical, it comes from the Greek criterion or krites. Okay, so criterion is an idea that there are certain elements that are in place that we use in order to judge something as sound or not sound, or to support something or not to support something. You may be more familiar with the plural of the word criterion, criteria. So if you're trying to decide if you have some kind of a mental health disorder, you're diagnosing somebody, you have criteria. There are these symptoms that you look at, and if they have them, then you can judge them to have that mental health disorder. But critical in this case just means to judge something. And we're not talking about biblical judgment. We're talking about making a judgment based on the evidence that's being provided to you, and then coming up with sound reasoning based on that. So critical thinking, you can think of it as judgmental in terms of judging the evidence, much like in a court of law, where you're trying to figure out if something is reasonable or not reasonable, and then forming an opinion based on the reason that you've come up with. Okay, so critical thinking in science. And it is important that we think about critical thinking from a scientific perspective, which isn't to say that you don't have beliefs that are based on spiritualism, religion, and things like that. But we are focusing on a way that we interpret information academically and scholastically based on the scientific method. Accepting claims is a part of how we evaluate the evidence that's provided to us and the evidence that we seek out. We try to find evidence that uses high quality data. We use an empirical model to be able to find the information about any given claim that's being made in order to evaluate. And empiricism is based on observation. We need to observe something, not just think about it, not just think about it theoretically, but look at evidence, weigh evidence on both sides of an argument. And we'll talk a little bit about inductive and deductive reasoning later on, and there are 2 chapters that are specific to those things. But we need to incorporate information that we gather, the research, the real research, not the quoted research, but the real research that uses good data from resources that are academic in nature. Okay? And the claims that we see will be based on opinions, conclusions, and beliefs. Okay, so when we make a claim, it's based on something, but we need to compare our information, our research, our opinions, conclusions, and beliefs to good standards that are out there. So we need to be able to find academic resources, trustworthy experts, not just people who are in authority, but actual experts on a topic, and other ways of knowing that we'll get into throughout this throughout this course. So some people think that because a theory is a theory, that all the ideas are okay because who knows what's true out there, but that's really not the case. So let's take a look at situations where theories are different from one another. Okay. So when you think of a well-established theory, like Darwin's theory of evolution, that has a lot of research that goes into it, has been backed up by tons of empirical evidence, things that have been measured, things that we've seen throughout time. We've seen excavations from archaeological sites that have revealed the true nature of evolution. And some people will say, well, it is still just a theory of evolution because it's just a theory. It's just a collection of ideas. But Darwin's evolutionary theories are rooted in empirical research, gold standard type experiments, comparing data over a long period of time. Some people think, well, gee, didn't Darwin just do this in the Galapagos Islands and, it just happened all of a sudden? No, there was a lot of research that went into it. It was more than just his own observations. He mapped it against other things that have been witnessed by archaeologists and other anthropologists to recognize that there are indeed evolutionary things that are going on. Okay. So Darwin's theory has been one of the best supported theories in all of science, and he really used a scientific method in order to develop his theory, not just an idea of what he thought about. So look at these big sweeties, also those big babies. So Darwinism can explain how all of these come from one general ancestor type dog. So a canine that has been around for thousands and thousands of years gets crossbred into these evolutionary different tracks. While they're still part of the same phylum and family of animals, it's still something that we recognize as evolutionary differences between them, because all these big beautiful babies don't look the same. They don't have the same traits. They don't have the same levels of agility. They don't have the same levels of intellect. So they're all different, but they come from the same place. And as we're able to see these long-term evolutionary characteristics played out, like in dogs, we can also see them even within one lifetime, something called epigenetics. And again, that's part of Darwinism, where epigenetics are things that our bodies adapt to even within one lifetime. So when we think of other theories, and if they are, as good as other theories, we think of something like the round Earth theory. So round Earth theory is the idea, the theory that we live on, in fact, a round planet. It's not exactly round; it's like some kind of an oblate spheroid, but it's not flat like flat Earth theory proponents suggest it is. And we know that because there's a lot of evidence that supports that we live on a round Earth, and the evidence that we live on a flat Earth has to flout scientific reasoning and evidence, and lots of experiential type evidence that we've gathered through going into outer space, launching satellites, taking pictures from suborbital planes and things like that. So we'd have to really flout a lot of evidence. So while round Earth theory and flat Earth theory are both theories, one is clearly better than another. And we have to remember that just because something is a theory and it has some kind of understanding that people follow doesn't mean that it's still as good as a more correct version of a theory or a different theory that is more correct. When we think of something like that, we can think of like the word school. If you spelled out school, SCHOOL, that is more correct than the spelling SKOOL, even though if somebody were to read that, they'd both be able to understand. So while we're saying, well, geez, they both convey the same message, yes, but one is obviously more correct than another. Or if you you use the word sugar to mean that white tasty stuff that you put on things to make it taste better. If somebody said, I like sugar, and then somebody else said, well, I like, and then whatever the chemical makeup of sugar is, they'd both be right, but one is more contextually correct. So we have to recognize that these theories that we talk about do have degrees of correctness to them. So we can't just use a completely pluralistic viewpoint and say, well, geez, everybody's correct because it's all relative, right? So we have to recognize that there are some things that are more correct than others. Otherwise, there's no point in talking about any of this because everything is okay. And while we recognize that we also want to be inclusive of ideas, they also need to be reasonable ideas, and they need to be based on evidence and claims that are based on a scientific reasoning. Now, I alluded to this earlier, but the idea of belief perseverance is an issue when people refuse to drop their prior opinions or prior beliefs about something in the face of reasonable contrary evidence. Belief perseverance is a thinking error. when we have a new idea or something that confronts a way of thinking that makes that way of thinking incorrect or more wrong, or if you want to say less correct, that's fine too. We have this problem. It's perseverance, meaning that it perseveres. A belief perseveres even when there is refuting evidence for it. Okay? And usually this happens because people have a different motivation for believing something. So, for example, creationists wanted to deny Darwin's theory because they thought that it might suggest that the creator did not create things, that something happened naturally, and that it just progressed from there, and that there was no intelligent design behind it. And that would suggest that God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he's not in control of things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of what the creationists believe about it, and that there wasn't a coexistence between Darwinism, which is natural selection and evolution, and intelligent design, so creationism. In the same way, flat earthers also continue to believe that the earth is flat, even though there's contrary evidence. Why? Well, because sometimes you have an entrenched belief in something and you don't want to drop it because maybe there's some kind of cultural belonging that goes along with being a part of a group that believes the same thing. Maybe you don't want to be embarrassed. Maybe there's a source of pride that makes you feel like, well, geez, if I'm wrong about this, then I can be wrong about other things, so I'd rather just, say, no, you're wrong, and then have this irrational sense of reason. So when we are confronted with evidence that is reasonable, that somebody makes, or a claim that somebody supports with good evidence, then we need to really be careful about what we choose to keep ourselves entrenched in. So if we have a line of thought that conflicts with our current belief, but that line of thought appears to be more well-reasoned, based on your interpretation of the reasoning, and they follow good critical thinking skills, then we have to consider the fact that we might be wrong about something, which I know nobody wants to be wrong about something, and that we need to adjust the way that we form an opinion or think about something. So we want to avoid belief perseverance, and one of the ways that we can do this is by talking about, in this class, the idea of judging claims and using evidence to support them, and then coming to our own opinions and conclusions, or at the very least, tweaking our own to adapt to the new line of thinking that we are being confronted with. So why do we need to improve thinking? Well, if we don't improve our thinking, then we engage in what are called thinking errors. So thinking errors are these mistakes that we make when we are using judgment and reasoning. Sometimes we'll use a logical error where we will affirm the consequent, which we'll learn about a little bit later in this course. Or we otherwise don't think critically. We get sucked in by a first impression. We believe what we hear without discriminating whether or not it's true. But what's most interesting is that when people don't use critical thinking and they get taken advantage of, for example, that's what highlights the need to improve thinking. In psychology and a lot of other parts of life, sometimes the best way to know that something is wrong is to see when something goes wrong. So when a thinking error goes wrong, or we engage in a thinking error, then we recognize that we need to think more critically. Okay? So an example of a thinking error is something like this. Birds of a feather flock together. Also, that opposites attract. It doesn't take much of a discerning ear to hear that those are two opposite things that we usually hold to be true. Some people will say, yeah, we're opposite from each other. That's why we're attracted to each other. But also that I like to be around people who are just like me, because birds of a feather flock together. You can't entertain both of those in all realms of life and accept them as equally true, because those are not equally true suppositions about the world. So we can't just use common sense in order for us to develop an opinion of the world. And there are probably other problems with those two statements. Birds of a feather flock together. Maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that you all engage in the same thinking, or if you do, you might have different opinions. What's worse is that we can engage in what's called groupthink, where we will engage in a thought process that is similar to other people, and we start to assume that the entire group feels the same way, especially as its leaders. So we see thinking error with common sense. There's another set of thinking errors that can be costly. So things like how we assume money works. And we all like to think that, yeah, borrowing money is okay, or getting money through various methods can be lucrative, but the reality is that it doesn't work that way. Get-rich-quick schemes like Ponzi schemes, which are also called pyramid schemes, I think you can extend this to mid-level marketing, but don't tell the Tupperware people I said that. And then we also have credit card debt. So if we start with credit card debt, you can see that minimum payments are problematic. If you ever had a credit card or have gotten into credit card trouble, you recognize that one of the biggest problems is that you're only supposed to make a minimum payment according to the credit card company. And there's even been some legislature that says that for each credit card statement you get, they have to tell you how long it would take you to pay off your credit card if you made the minimum payments. The reason why that's there is because there was a thinking error that people engaged in, that I can suspend payment until later and get the thing that I want now, which is not a great thing, because all of a sudden you have this wonderful thing and you still might be paying for this wonderful thing long after you have it anymore. You buy some nice lawn furniture from Home Depot and you put it on your Home Depot credit card because you saved money that way. Well, okay, fine. 2 years later, you're still paying on your lawn furniture that got eaten by mice over the winter or something like that. Usually what happens is that the interest washes out the payment, because you have so much interest in a credit card that you're paying that it doesn't even start to make a dent in what you owe on that credit card, because if you're paying 20, 25, 30% every year on a credit card making minimum payments, you aren't making a very big dent in your overall payment. Another example is a Ponzi scheme. So I want to show you a clip of this. If you go to the PowerPoint, then you can click on the link for the Ponzi scheme, but I'll show you a more accessible example. So as you can see from that example, there are clear issues in thinking. He uses authority in the guy because he has a Corvette, which is no reason to put authority in anybody. He's ignoring the obvious idiom, the get rich quick, and he doesn't recognize that that's something that is used idiomatically to suggest that you won't get rich quick. So there's a lot going on there, and he engages in that thought until it's made abundantly clear to him that, oh, this is not a great thing for me to be doing. I need to make a phone call because you have to withdraw investment money. So these thinking errors can be very costly. So we also recognize that there are some deficiencies in critical thinking. So we found that in research on college students, they're not as proficient as reasoning as we'd like, and there's lots of reasons for that. But among them are, it takes more effort to be a critical thinker. To just believe what you want to believe is not very taxing. To just form an opinion based on these heuristics or these rules that we have about interpreting and internalizing information are not very difficult to do. Whereas using logic and reasoning and arguments to come to a sound conclusion, that takes effort and it takes a little bit more time. Okay. Another thing that we find in critical thinking is that while we know that pseudoscience is false science, people will generally believe pseudoscience, especially if it fits some other aspect of their character that is related to the pseudoscientific thing. For example, horoscopes are pseudoscientific. They're not based on science. They've been debunked, but people still like to believe them because they make them feel good. So we have a whole belief system that's based on feeling good rather than having sound reasoning and argument skills. So we're all susceptible to misconceptions. There's nothing wrong with that, but we need to be better at developing critical thinking in order to avoid the thinking errors that we normally will fall prey to unless we are thinking on our toes. Another example of errors in thinking are superstitions. And again, especially when I talk to athletes, we find that superstition is a large part of the game. It helps to settle people down. It gives them a sense of confidence, but it's not based on reality. The secondary effects of superstition are kind of real, right? Like if I don't step on a line when I'm going onto the field, I feel more confident that I'm going to play better, and that confidence is what makes you play better, not having stepped over the line. So there are lots of different ways to motivate yourself, but superstition can be one. But usually superstitions are rooted in a belief that's based on some kind of reinforcement of a behavior. Like, for example, if I'm a baseball player and I tap the plate 5 times and I hit a home run, guess what I'm going to do from now on? I'm going to tap the plate 5 times because it made me hit a home run. Despite the evidence that says that I'm not going to hit a home run every time, having done that one time is enough for me to keep doing it. So superstition is kind of a reward system based on the behavior that you engage in. Lots of times superstition are also locked into supernatural things, such as luck or fortune. And a lot of Eastern cultures, especially Indo-Asian cultures, use luck or fortune as a way to guide their lives. If you've been to any Chinese restaurant, you'll see the Chinese zodiac, and you'll know what animal you are and who you're supposed to marry and everything like that. So those are all based on superstitions. Some of those are rooted more in American culture than the Indo-Chinese culture. For example, fortune cookies, sorry to burst your bubble, are an American invention from San Francisco, not from China. So there are lots of things that we consider to be superstitious, and sometimes because they're rooted in a different culture, that adds some mysticism to it. But the reality is that superstitions are just superstitions. We did something one time, we got rewarded for it somehow, and we keep on doing it despite the fact that it doesn't actually connect to the thing that we did or that we got rewarded for. So we have to also talk about what it takes to think critically. It's not just something that people do, or now that you know about critical thinking, you can critically think. There is a process to it, and the process kind of has some steps, and there are probably more steps than this if you wanted to nitpick and break things down. But in general, you need to know about reasoning and critical thinking skills. So you actually have to know about critical thinking to critically think. People can do it naturally, but like anything, you can do it naturally, but with training, you can get much better at it. And one of the problems with how we naturally critically think is that we probably have some errors in there that we're not aware of because we don't have a formal process to it. So we're here to look at a formal process that will kind of integrate topic by topic throughout this course. So we need to have knowledge of the reasoning and critical thinking skills. We also have to have topical knowledge of something. There are a lot of people that have a lot of things to say about things that they don't know about. You can look anywhere for that. So you have to know something about the topic. Most of the time people just want to be interesting, or they want to be engaged in conversation, or they want to just chime in on something. So they'll apply a thought process, something that they don't know about, and that can oftentimes backfire. So we have to also know about the topic that we're talking about. We also need to be aware of our own thinking, so that metacognitive process, and how we regulate it. So being constantly reflective of our thought process and kind of reviewing the conclusions that we came to, how we came to those conclusions, and what we used to integrate those conclusions that we came to. And then what that kind of leads to is what's called a CT disposition, or critical thinking disposition. A disposition is a stance that we have on something. So if we have a disposition that's not critically thinking and is just kind of firing off whatever opinions we have without support, we don't have well-reasoned arguments, then our disposition is not from a critical thinking stance. So we want to develop this critical thinking disposition, and we do that through various means, but typically it's through the aggregation of knowledge of the skills that we have, the topical knowledge and awareness of our own thinking. And those all kind of feed into that critical thinking disposition. Now, in order to develop that critical thinking disposition, there are several bits of knowledge and skills that we have to be aware of. And again, this is an introductory chapter to the overall theme of critical thinking, so we're going to be talking about these in more detail. But in general, we need to know what the rules are for reasoning that underline the ability to reason in different situations. So we have to be able to know that there are certain rules in place that help us arrive at a well-reasoned argument. And oftentimes we recognize that there are rules that need to be in place by the violations of the rules. Excuse me. So when people violate rules of critical thinking, that's when we oftentimes know that, oh, there probably is a rule for this that somebody violated. Like if somebody just spouts out an opinion based on something that they observed themselves, you're like, well, wait a second, that's just your opinion. So that kind of casual, that's just your opinion statement really means that, oh, you didn't think about this from other perspectives. You didn't integrate other issues into this. You don't have topical knowledge. This is just your observation of it, which would lead to then the skill of inductive reasoning, where you're trying to increase the amount of examples from that one opinion to see if your opinion is valid or if it's just based on your limited scope of the topic. And then we also need to develop skills for distinguishing arguments from non-arguments and for recognizing those thinking errors. So there are going to be some good arguments that people have, but there are also non-arguments that people will espouse instead of an actual argument. So we need to be able to tell the difference between arguments and non-arguments, and for recognizing thinking errors. So things like circular logic. Did somebody justify what they said within itself? Again, that's another thinking error that we'll get into a little bit later in more detail in the course. But we certainly need to be careful of recognizing those errors that people make and distinguishing the arguments from non-arguments, because that's what's going to lead us to develop our critical thinking skills. We have to have that topical knowledge, so the background knowledge that's relevant to the subject, and we also need to know when to not insert ourselves in a conversation. So if we have topical knowledge, great. If we don't, we need to wait until we do. You can say, you know what, I don't know about the topic, but it sounds like the way that you got to that conclusion might be a little bit aired. So you can talk about that, but you can't really talk much about the topic. So you'll be limited to talking to people about the critical thinking process as opposed to the actual topic itself, which in itself isn't bad, but you can't really state your own opinion on a topic unless you know about the topic. Just because you know about critical thinking doesn't mean that you can just say something about a topic. Next was that metacognition perspective, so awareness of your own thinking, how we regulate it, and you also need to know the limits of your knowledge and thinking skills. So it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not sure what this topic is about, so I can't really speak on it, or, well, I don't know about that, so I'll have to do my own research looking into the facts of this. So it's okay to say that in a conversation. That doesn't mean that you've lost a conversation or an argument, which really shouldn't be the goal anyways, right? To win or to lose, but to gain information and gain perspective. That's the goal. But you need to know when you don't know about a topic and to say, you know what, I just don't know. And that's okay to say. Sometimes it feels threatening to say that because maybe it's a point of pride or something like that you want to know something. Or you don't want to be seen as somebody who's incompetent. Or maybe people think that you should know something. It's okay to not know something. That's perfectly fine. And to say that is very reasonable too. It's a lot better than trying to fake your way through something, because at the very least you'll out yourself as somebody who doesn't know about a topic. At worst, you could mislead other people into believing something that isn't true or that you haven't done a good job of supporting. And again, the critical thinking disposition. The disposition is the stance that you have. So more specifically, it's the attitudes, traits, thinking styles, motives that leads you to thinking more critically. So we have open-mindedness, and that's a willingness to examine new ideas. Open-mindedness, it does not mean that you accept things indiscriminately. Right, that's not what open-mindedness is. It means that you're willing to examine new ideas. As a person, you don't have to accept anything that you don't want to, but it is important that we have an open mind for new ideas and to integrate them in a critical way. And then fair-mindedness is when we want to look at ideas that are on the other side of something. So open-mindedness might be, I'm going to use my ideas to support some kind of reason, but I might use your ideas too, as long as they agree with mine. But fair-mindedness means going and looking at the other side of the issue, the opposite stance that you have on an issue, to see if there's a way that you can increase your understanding of an issue. So we want to look at those other things. This is the part that people don't do a great job at doing in general, is looking at the other side of a topic. We have to look at the other side too so that we can integrate all the ideas. Otherwise, all we're doing is we're using the reasoning that we already agree with to support our stance on something, and that's not critical thinking. And then we want to have a skeptical attitude. So skepticism isn't cynicism. So skepticism means that we question and we want to seek evidence. We want to look for the truth of something that, before we believe it. Okay, that doesn't mean that we're cynical, like we just don't believe something, right? So if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I think that the world is flat. I'm going to be like, oh, that's stupid. It's not flat. It's dumb. We know that it's round. Okay. Now, even if I believe that, the cynical attitude is just to defeat somebody, to not look at the evidence. But a skeptical attitude is to say, well, actually, there's been a lot of evidence that supports that the Earth is round. We have satellite imagery. We've been able to triangulate different points on the Earth. Even thousands of years ago, they were looking at shadows from these tall statues, and at different times of the day, the shadows were different lengths, which suggested that we're on a curved planet. So I can provide those arguments for a round Earth theory, but I'm doing it from kind of using information that I know, maybe asking questions or saying, that doesn't sound right that the Earth is flat. I have some questions about that, and then kind of like stating those questions and seeing what the other person says about it. And if you're dealing with an equally skeptical and critically thinking person, maybe then you can come to a conclusion about something that's more rational. But again, that skeptical attitude is more a stance of I'm going to ask some questions and before I believe something new. I'm not just going to believe it because somebody in a position of authority told it to me. I'm not going to believe it because it's somebody that I like or somebody who I'm affiliated with, or we're all part of the same group, so I have to believe the same thing. The skeptical attitude means that whatever information you have coming in, you run it through that critically thinking lens. Now, there are cases where we can use critical thinking selectively, and one of the hallmark examples of that is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes. Okay. Oh, misspelling. I can fix that. Got it. And when he wrote the books, he used critical thinking because he walks through these very interesting and complicated cases where they have to solve a mystery. Okay, but he in his real life and in the person life that he has, he wasn't always so critical when it came to things like spiritualism. There was a big feud between him and Harry Houdini, who was a debunker, and he would debunk spiritualism, seances, and things like that. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would suspend his critical thinking skills when it came to things like interacting with people from the other side or with a deceased person. And even though there was evidence to the contrary that said, no, actually what people are doing is during a seance, they're using these tricks and everything, he chose not to believe it. So he would selectively use those critical thinking skills. And we see people doing that a lot, where somebody might be willing to have a critical thinking approach to a topic that is that's something that they don't really care about. But when it comes to something that they care about and that they believe deeply, they refuse to come off of it. And as you remember from earlier, we called that belief perseverance. So if we have selective CT, which means that some people can engage in critical thinking in some realms and not in others, then the question is, why do people hold false beliefs? Why do they hold on to those false beliefs? Well, we have a couple of ideas to think about. We have this dual process theory. And the dual process theory is a theory that suggests that we kind of have these two systems in terms of thinking. And one is a fast system, one is a slow system. And I kind of alluded to this before and how we use these fast methods to come to a conclusion. All right, there are these rules that we have. There are these systems that we have in place, these structured belief systems that we have that allow us to make quick decisions without having to really think much. And that's the type 1 thinking. It's intuitive and based on experience. We call it system 1 thinking. But if we're going to critically think, we have to engage more in that slower, methodical, intentional type of thinking that we call the rational analytic system, or system 2 thinking. So if you want to just kind of put it in order, first is fast and second is slow. Okay. So type 1 is fast, type 2 is slow. So when we look at the dual processing theory, we have some questions that you can ask. So if I ask you something like, what are the answers to the following questions? Then I say 4 plus 5, you can immediately say 9. Because that's system 1 thinking. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's based on experience. We've seen this before. Probably didn't even need to do the functional math in your head. You could probably recognize that equation, be like, oh, that's 9, without much thought. Okay. But if I ask you the second question, if a bat and a ball costs $1.10 and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Well, wait a second. We have to think about that for a second. There's kind of like a trick that's happening. It's like, oh, wait a second. I have to do some math. Oh, wait, maybe the bat costs $1. Well, wait a second. If the bat costs $1, then that means that the ball costs 10 cents, but that means that the bat only costs 90 cents more. Now we have to do some math and figure it out, but we have to walk through this process. Right? It's slow, it's rational, it's analytical. And if you don't get out a paper and pencil and kind of do a little bit of algebra, which probably most people wouldn't care or know how to do anyways, you wouldn't come to the right conclusion. So we look at this equation and say, well, if a bat and a ball costs $1.10, the bat costs $1 more. How much does the ball cost? Well, wait a second. If the ball costs 5 cents, that means that the bat costs $1.05. $1.05 plus 5 cents is 10 cents, and $1.05 minus 5 cents is $1, which means that the ball costs 5 cents and the bat costs $1.05. So when you see these examples, these are just very basic examples, but these are part of the dual process theory, that once you have experience about an equation like in number 1, then you can answer it very quickly without a lot of thought. But in the second one, you don't have a basis for that equation, unless you've seen this particular example before, but you don't have a basis for that equation, so you have to really think about it. So type 2 thinking is rational, it's analytical. And most of the time, your first guess on that second question was wrong. You needed to go back and fix it. You had to go back and fix it. So that means that we have more analytical thinking that's happening. Okay. So critical thinkers often use that type 2 or that slower rational analytical thinking for important questions. It's slower. It's more deliberate. We want to ask questions. We need to deliberate. So if we want to decide which theory of learning is the best theory, then we have to go through and look at each of those theories and see how they apply to different situations, and then come to a conclusion on which one theory fits the best among the different scenarios that you might come up with. Okay. When we have new evidence, we need to use type 2 thinking so that we can look at the relevant information and evaluate the qualities so that we can come to this well-reasoned conclusion that allows us to base it on the reality of what we're investigating and integrate it into a knowledge base that we have, and also check it out with different perspectives. It's a lot of work, but that's why we have so few critical thinkers in the world. We can't just accept something based on who says it or what's being said. We have to run it through this critical thinking lens in order for us to make some kind of conclusion based on arguments and claims. Which brings us to basic terminology. So in this course, we're going to be talking about things like arguments, claims, opinions, and evidence. So when we talk about arguments, we're not talking about just like getting into a match and shouting back and forth and trying to convince somebody of something. But an argument is a claim or a conclusion that's taken along with the evidence. Okay, so it's to say something like, I think that the Earth is round because we have pictures from outer space that shows a round Earth. So then a claim is that statement that asserts something about a characteristic or a property that something has. So I could say like, I believe that the Earth is round. That's the claim. Okay, that's just a plain claim. In the prior example, I said the Earth is round because ... That was the argument. So it's a claim plus the evidence. But the claim is just what I'm saying about the Earth. The Earth is round. Right? Or I could say that people are basically selfish. Right? That could be a claim, but without an argument, it's not, or excuse me, without evidence, it's not an argument. Okay, and the claim that somebody makes has a truth value. That truth value can be really low. I could say something like, the moon is filled with cheese, right? That's a claim. I'm stating something about the moon, and it has a truth value to it. The truth value in that case is 0. The moon is not filled with cheese, which is unfortunate because cheese is yummy and everything, but it just isn't. So the claim can be whatever somebody says, but without that evidence, we have to figure out the value of that claim itself. Okay. Now, we also have opinions, and opinions are just ideas. Okay, they're just ideas that somebody has, but without evidence, they're not very supportive or persuasive. Okay, we have to have evidence with our opinions. Okay? So an opinion can also be a claim, but opinions usually don't have to be rooted in reality. They could be based on whatever somebody wants to say. Okay, an opinion could be something like, I think that Pizza Hut has the best pizza. Right? So you don't have to have evidence for that to have that opinion. If you did have that opinion, if you did have that evidence, then your opinion might be stronger. You might be able to bump it up to an argument to say that, there are some objective reasons why Pizza Hut has the best pizza, and you could talk about the quality of the crust and ingredients and things like that and some objective measurement. But if you're talking about just an opinion, it's just an opinion. You don't have to really support it by anything. And then the probably the most important part of critical thinking is the evidence. This is the reason. Evidence is the reason that we're able to make a claim turn into an argument. All right, so we have to have evidence, and the evidence isn't just, I found out this, but you also have to figure out if your evidence is worthy evidence. So it supports the claim or conclusion because you are supporting a claim with evidence that suggests the claim increases truth. Okay? So there is that truth value. So if we have more supportive evidence and we're able to look at the counter evidence and evaluate it as well, that strengthens the truth of our claim. So all of these kind of go together. So when we look at the basic argument, it goes from a claim on the left side of this figure. It goes from a claim to an argument only because reason supports the claim. So you can have a claim and a conclusion, okay? Or you can have a reason and then a claim and then a conclusion. And if you have the reason, then that supports everything. Okay? You can't just have a claim and then a conclusion. Otherwise, you sound like you're not supporting your conclusion. Although there are plenty of people out there, politicians mostly, and that's both sides of the aisle, not trying to be confrontational or anything, but on both sides of the aisle, politicians oftentimes will use a claim and then a conclusion, but no real reason behind it. So when you are listening to somebody and you are listening for their conclusion, there are some keywords that you can listen for. All right, that a conclusion is coming. So we have things like therefore, thus, hence, in conclusion, accordingly, consequently. It suggests that there is some kind of order to the way that we talk about things and the order that we move from reason to claim to conclusion. All right, and if we're looking for the evidence in our claim, then we need to look for words like, for example, because of, it is known that. So if we have those phrases, those are indications that what we're going to be talking about is in support of our claim. Okay? And by the way, in academic writing, a lot of times you can see that there is some kind of evidence because it will have a citation. So if you need to make a claim and that has support behind it, you're usually going to use another resource to support that claim. So if you're able to go through the Smithsonian records, you can look through their photo gallery, and you can see that, oh, look, we have pictures from outer space of Earth dating all the way back to the 1960s, and you can cite that and say, hey, NASA had submitted to the Smithsonian these pictures, and these are now archival records, and these support the idea that even as far back as the 1960s, there's been a unified idea that the Earth is round, substantiated by evidence taken by satellites, for example. So you would have those kind of bits of information that support the ideas that you're coming up with. Now, we can also have counter evidence and counter arguments, which is a perfectly reasonable thing in an argument. We need to have a counter argument because if we're going to have an argument, if we're going to have a well-reasoned claim, which is the argument, then someone else is probably going to have a counter argument. So the counter argument is the claim that supports the other side. And it's reasonable. We need to have these things. We need to be looking at that evidence too and critically evaluating it. So it's not just what we think and the evidence that we have, but also evaluating the evidence that other people have. So when you have a conversation with somebody and you are on opposite sides, you can evaluate their critical thinking and say, well, wait a second, the evidence that you have is based on what somebody told you. The evidence that I have is based on records that we have. Right, things that that have been written down, that have been evaluated by peer review and is in a scholarly article. Those are two different types of evidence, and you can say, well, my evidence outweighs your evidence in that way. Okay, so if we have an argument like the Earth is flat, I can see that it continues off into the distance. The counter argument might be the Earth is round. This satellite photo shows it is roughly spherical. Okay, so we have two different types of arguments, or two different arguments, that the Earth is flat, that the Earth is round, and then one bit of evidence is I can see that it continues off into the distance. Well, that statement is based on what somebody is observing. It's empirical evidence, but it's only observation based on their limited perspective. They can't get up high enough to see the curvature of the Earth, for example. The evidence in the second counter argument is that the satellite photo shows it's roughly spherical. Well, we have photo evidence of something, and yeah, people will say, well, the photo's been doctored or whatever. Okay, but if we get it from a reliable resource that's reasonably trustworthy, like an archive or something like that, then you can trust that evidence is better than the evidence that says I can see that it continues off into the distance, which is, again, based on that limited perspective. It's really anecdotal evidence at that point. Now, inquiry is the notion that when we're looking for some kind of conclusion, we need to increase the knowledge by finding more evidence. Okay, so inquiry is about digging into something. Now, everything that you do won't require vast amounts of research, I promise. But it is how we come to well-reasoned conclusions if we're trying to make some kind of thesis point. So if you're writing a paper or something like that, you need to have evidence to support what you're saying. You can't just utter something and then hope that it's true. It needs to be supported by evidence. Okay. Sometimes people will use reasoning strategies and still make thinking errors, such as that arguing from ignorance, like you just don't know something. So somebody says, well, we have a flat Earth. And I say, well, actually, we have, photos and people. If you go in an airplane, you can even see the curvature of the Earth and things like that. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that, which would be a wonderful thing, right? Because that would mean that somebody is actually open-minded and willing to look at the other perspective. But if somebody's arguing from ignorance where they just didn't know something, then that's where they're lacking inquiry. So if they're open-minded, they will engage in inquiry to learn something new about the argument that they have, and then they might change their mind, which would be a wonderful thing. If you don't use inquiry and you're using thinking errors, then you're probably just going to get entrenched in your own ignorance. You're just going to get deeper and deeper into a perspective that you aren't able to dig yourself out of. Okay. So last is a kind of an extension of inquiry. That's that ignorance or possibility. Okay. So when we argue from ignorance or possibility, it's a thinking error mostly because there's a conclusion that somebody comes to just because it may be possible or it is not known to be false. That's really where we say, well, you can't prove that the Earth isn't flat. We're like, we kind of can, but their perspective is that, oh, well, it's possible. You can't prove that it's not possible, so I'm going to continue to believe that it's possible. And usually when we get into a conversation like that, we talk about, okay, so what's the likelihood of it then? But people like that don't care. They're usually engaging what's called dichotomous thinking, or when you only believe that it can be true or false. So when we think about critical thinking, we have to believe that there are different degrees of truth of something. So if somebody says, for example, that the Earth is round, well, technically it's not round. It's a spheroid. It's a little bit compressed at the poles. It bulges at the middle. So it's kind of a spheroid. It's spherical-ish, but it's not completely round. So even then, that's not a complete truism to say that the Earth is just round. But it's rounder than it is flat. So we agree that the likelihood that the Earth is round is better than the Earth is flat. So the conclusion that people have are based on, if you're critical thinking, are based on kind of the likelihood of something being true. And then eventually, yeah, you kind of do believe that it is or is not true, but it's based on kind of like the sliding scale. And the further you get to one side, the more likely the truth of it is. Well, people who argue from ignorance or possibility only think that something is or is not true. They don't think that there is a middle anywhere. And usually it's impossible to get somebody to come off of their perspective because if there's any error in an argument, they perceive the whole argument to be flawed. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the class too. Okay. So the example that we have here is that scientists have not been able to prove that extrasensory perception does not exist. Therefore, it probably does exist. Well, there's been a lot of evidence that has been tested to show that extrasensory perception hasn't existed in the tests that have been run, that have been well planned out. But the proponents of ESP will say, well, there could be this situation or there could be this situation, or they retreat to things like, oh, well, you can't test this in that scenario because it interferes with the ability for ESP to work and things like that. So they retreat to these pseudoscientific ideas, which is very common among people who believe such things. So that is it for chapter 1. And we have talked about the introductory aspects of critical thinking. So when we come back, we'll look at chapter 2, and we'll continue to work through deductive reasoning, prediction, and how we make assumptions, and then we'll just keep chugging along. So thank you for hanging out and listening to this lecture. Hope you gleaned a lot from it. Hope I explained things that maybe enhanced your learning, and we look forward to seeing you next time.